Salmon. Salmon is a fish. Salmon is a delicious fish. Salmon is big in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up eating salmon. I started in the industry cooking salmon in restaurants everywhere. In this menu, I wanted to honor salmon. There's a lot of historical significance related with salmon. The Native Americans historically relied on salmon for survival. Being from the Pacific Northwest, salmon means more than just a fish to me. Salmon roe is a very important part of the salmon. The salmon roe we typically eat most of the time is harvested from the chum salmon. It's a smaller salmon, not as big as the Chinook or the king or the coho salmon that we use for fillet cuts. It's a smaller salmon, but the roe is spectacular compared to the other salmons. So for this dish, I made a smoked salmon mousse. We got smoked salmon, dill, chives, creme fraiche in there. I thinly sliced cucumber on a mandolin. I was gonna make like a little burrito, put the mousse inside, and I tossed that cucumber in a little bit of lemon and chives as well. And to garnish that, some salmon roe. Salmon mousse on cucumber, can't go wrong there. However, with the salmon roe, the flavor was unbalanced. It's still a great dish if you really love salmon roe on its own, but it kind of dominated the dish. After using a lot of restraint in this first amuse bouche, I decided that I can kind of go in the opposite direction. I don't need to be as delicate with it. I would use a lot of restraint with sturgeon roe because sturgeon roe doesn't really need anything. It's already balanced in itself. And in my mind, that's not the case with salmon roe. I think I can get more bold with it. Salmon roe, I liken that to goat cheese in the sense of it's very, very strong and it can pair up and stand up to a lot of ingredients. For the second dish, I did something I've made before several times, just a pea salad with smoked salmon. In this amuse bouche, I kind of emulated that. I used peas, I used sugar snap peas, haricot vert, I used Irish bacon and water chestnuts. I confit the bacon in its own fat, chopped it up small along with the other spring vegetables, tossed it in a little creme fraiche, lemon juice and salt, and garnish that with some herb oil and salmon roe. You get the smokiness from the bacon, but you also get the salmon flavor from the roe, and then that pairs nicely in with the spring pea salad. After eating that dish, I knew in which direction I wanted to go with this roe. I wanted to take it even further. I wanted to add more flavors and more boldness to it. Super into sous vide lobster tail right now, so apparently I'm just putting it in everything. For this amuse bouche, I did sous vide lobster tail and then basted it with the saffron beurre blanc. Then I garnished that with some micro radish. I wanted the roe to sit on top of the greens versus the warm sauce and the lobster. I wanted to keep it somewhat chilled. Took a bite of that. Salmon roe totally stood up to the saffron. Upon popping them in your mouth, it added a lot of umami and salmon flavor to the tender lobster and the saffron beurre blanc. It all married well. And so I knew I could get maybe a little bit crazier. I did something that's pretty common in Japanese cuisine. I actually marinated the Ikura in a dashi soy marinade, and I let that sit in there for a couple hours. So it would add another base flavor, it would add another dimension to the roe itself. I know in Chinese cuisine they make these crispy bird's nests out of potatoes, so I wanted to do that with sweet potatoes. Because salmon I think can pair well with sweet flavors as well. So I wanted to kind of play with that in this fourth amuse bouche. Garnish it with the micro radish sprouts. It adds some spiciness and some earthiness to it. And then you have the marinated Ikura on top. When you take a bite, that was by far my favorite. All the flavors complemented each other. The look was amazing because you see a bird's nest and you see, you know, not only sticks, but you see some leaves and foliage in there. So you got that with the radish sprouts. You got that with the golden fried sweet potato julienne. And then you have the eggs, the salmon roe in the middle of the nest. So emulating nature, it was visually pleasing. And also the taste was super on point. You had crunchy, juicy, everything was there. Salmon roe is a very important part of the salmon. Now that you've tried some amuse bouches featuring that, we've prepared some cocktails for you to try so you can get nice and boozy before we sit down and have our coursed out tasting menu.
For the salmonberry gin fizz, this one is more or less a basic gin fizz, but the main ingredient was the salmonberry syrup, obviously. If you aren't familiar with what a salmonberry is, it's more or less a milder version of a raspberry. Like, you know, it has a little bit more of a pinker color. Like a light pink. Salmon color, yes, of course. Gin fizz components, so it was gin, lemon juice, egg white, and then we added the salmonberry syrup for flavor and color. Mixed all that up, and then we added some Prosecco on the top to give it a little bit more lift. For our version of the Poseidon Sambuca Sour, we used a little bit of Johnny Walker's Song of Ice Scotch. Then we added some Sambuca, equal parts. Then lime juice, a little bit of egg white, salmonberry simple syrup. We also added some blue curacao in there. Shook that all up. We garnished it with a little bit of sea salt, and yeah, it came out really, really good. Really caught like that afternoon at the beach in the Caribbean kind of water. Resort vacation ocean blue, if that makes any sense. So for this cocktail, we call this one the smoked salmonberry. We're keeping with our tradition of mezcal, which I'm also noticing. Yeah, every menu that we've done has had at least one mezcal cocktail to it. This one was mezcal-based cocktails. We also added a little bit of cognac, some Hennessy. Then we followed that up with some lemon juice, a little bit of salmonberry honey this time around, not syrup. It's for a little bit of a thicker texture to the drink. Add a little bit of dried ginger powder, another, variant in terms of flavor. We mixed all that together. We were trying to go for something that wasn't a paloma, and it's easy to lean into that paloma side with mezcal because of that smoky sweet kind of contrast. We toned down the mezcal with a little bit of the cognac, so it wasn't too much of a super smoky flavor. It had a little bit more of a sharp kick to it. I was happy with the second variation because the first one was more or less mezcal and salmonberry, and that was good, but we definitely felt like we could have stepped it up a little bit more. So leaned a little bit towards the cognac and the powdered ginger as well.
You're gonna see a lot of spring influences because it's spring, and when I think of salmon, I think of spring. I don't know why, but salmon pairs very well with spring vegetables and spring produce. So this first dish is a salmon cake served with a pea puree, chili oil, and micro pea shoots. Sous vide the salmon and mix that with cilantro, some chives, some jalapeno, and some dill. Also got some lemon juice and salt in there as well. Pan fried them, flash blanched the peas, blended them up with just a little bit of salt and lemon juice, kept it very, very light. We just garnished that with some micro pea shoots. The salmon cake is rich but still balanced with herbs and lemon juice. Then you have the light pea puree and you have the light pea shoots. Bon appetit. So the next dish, I'm calling this a jalapeno artichoke bacon dip sort of appetizer, if that makes sense. That's where my inspiration came from. When I think of bacon, I think of smoked salmon. I think of them interchangeably. There's a lot of the same sort of flavors there. So we have a poached artichoke bottom, tossed in a dashi soy jalapeno seed glaze, and then that's topped with a small piece of smoked salmon, and that's surrounded by an artichoke parmesan cream foam, and then that's also garnished with some micro radish and micro pea shoots. It tasted like jalapeno artichoke dip with bacon. It tasted amazing. Kept it creamy but lightened it up a little bit. Made a avocado pea paste. So that's avocado, peas, mint, lemon juice. It's very light, very refreshing, but it still has the richness of the avocado. Piece of seared salmon on top. Drench that in a ton of lemon juice. When I cook a salmon, I like to give it a good sear on both sides and take it off the heat at medium rare and let it rest till it reaches between medium rare and medium. The texture is very silky and creamy throughout, and that's my favorite way to have salmon, a nice crispy crust and a silky interior. I added some herb oil to add more greenery to the dish. You got the rich salmon, rich avocado. I added the micro pea vines as a garnish because we got peas in the dish, and also it's springtime. It works well with the salmon and they're really pretty. This is a salmon fillet poached in a seasoned morel dashi broth, served with seared lion's mane mushroom, seared beach mushroom, some rehydrated morel mushrooms, and a preserved truffle slice. My idea for this dish was to keep it very, very simple. I wanted to just barely poach the salmon. I originally grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Morel mushrooms are very plentiful over there. I've even gone hunting for morel mushrooms over when I lived in Washington State. Dashi you could make obviously with kombu, you can make with bonito, tuna flakes, or you can make it with dried shiitake mushrooms. When I think of mushrooms, I think of the woods and I think of the trees, and I often see cedar plank roasted salmon, so the mushrooms kind of add that foresty, earthy element. So for the seasoned dashi, I just reduced the morel dashi broth. I added a tiny, tiny bit of brown miso and soy sauce. I didn't want it to get cloudy. I wanted it to remain very clear so that you could see the mushrooms in the dish. The preserved black truffle slice, which is very earthy and funky, but not a white truffle, so it's not overly strong. We are moving into salmonberry territory. Native to the Pacific Northwest, I would describe the taste as similar to a raspberry. You have a salmonberry honey broiled feta served with salmonberry honey spears, lavender buds, and Greek olive oil. I used direct spherification to create these salmonberry honey spheres. I wanted them to be like salmon roe, where there's that outer membrane, and when you bite into it, it's filled with juice. When I introduced this menu to you, I introduced you with salmon roe, and as I'm leaving you, I want to leave you with something that emulates salmon roe. There's different ways to name this puff pastry dessert depending on what jams or garnishes you're using. But we'll go with salmonberry Napoleon. I made a salmonberry syrup, and I also made a Chambord whipped cream. I added in the Chambord because it's a raspberry liqueur, and raspberry parallels the salmonberry flavor a lot, so I thought that would be a nice addition. I added a little of the Peychaud bitters for a little bit of color and also just a little bit of a bitter note in there as well. The puff pastry, I cooked those. They're nice and pillowy. I think typically when people make Napoleons, they weigh down the dough and make them more flat, but I just didn't do that. And then I garnished it with some salmonberry honey spheres. I wanted to again leave you with where I started, with the texture of salmon roe. Thank you so much for watching this. Thank you for coming to my dinner party. Thank you for being my guest. Don't forget to subscribe, it helps me a lot. Culinary art has been a way that I've expressed myself since I was a young child. I remember I was like, I turned around and then you had one of my knives and you were cutting the ice and I was like, oh no! So then I saw it at the store and I was like, oh, I have to get this for him. A lot of the time because I only have that Scotch ice.